Welcome to Mic Action Podcast. I'm your host, Donna Eade, serial podcaster and mentor, here to guide you through the world of podcasting. Let's dive in. Welcome back to the Mic Action Podcast, everybody. I'm so glad to have you here with me today. We are going to be talking about the systems that I use to produce my podcast. One of the three biggest reasons I feel people stop podcasting is because they don't have a strong enough why, that they don't have realistic expectations, and they don't have their systems in place. So this is a really important episode if you are looking to start your podcast. And the first thing I wanted to highlight was actually last week's episode. So last week's episode, we were talking about podcast equipment and what you need to get started. And that is kind of the first sort of system that I use, is my equipment, my setup. So if you want to go and listen back to that one, if you missed it, I talk about microphones, I talk about software, I talk about all of the get up that goes along with a microphone that you might want to invest in, and why you don't have to invest in anything to get started. So that is a great episode to go and listen to for the basic tools of podcasting. But then we move into how do we actually manage these podcast episodes? And for me, I've currently got 3 episodes going out a week. This is the penultimate episode of this first series of Mic Action Podcast. So make sure that you are subscribed to my email list by going to donnaeade.com/podsquad if you want to get notified when the next season starts. So you've got this episode and next week, and then we will be taking the summer off. We will be back in early autumn, but if you want to get notification of that, then make sure you go to donnaeade.com/podsquad, sign up, and you will get notified. And you'll also get emails about Mindset and Action, my other podcast, so you can keep up with me over on that podcast during the summer. So, my project management tool of choice is Asana. Now, there are plenty of project management tools out there. I'm sure you have got your favorites, but you can use Trello, Notion, Monday.com. There are a lot of different types of project management tools out there. This is how I manage my podcast. So I have in my Asana set up a podcast project, and in there each episode gets its own task, and within that task is a whole list of everything that needs to happen for that episode to get out. Now, I just have a template done for that, and then every time a new episode is being added to the workflow, I just duplicate that original post, change the name to the number of the podcast, and then I fill it in as I go. I also have stages and I move them along. I quite like that visual of seeing things move from one side of the page to the other as they get finished, and also ticking things off. The thing I love about Asana is that unicorns fly across your screen when you tick off a task. So it just makes it fun for me. So I use Asana to do that. I also use it for my guest episodes. There are more steps involved in my guest episodes because I like to make sure that they have everything they need. So there are 6 different email templates that I have for my guest episodes. They're in templates in my email provider, so that when I need to send something to a guest, I will literally go find that template, fill in the blanks, and send that off to them to prepare them. And then I'll go back into Asana and tick that email has been sent. So that is how I use Asana to manage my podcast episodes. It's got all of the different stages in there written down. And I could go over that if you're interested in knowing what my Asana task looks like. Let me know, and maybe in season 2 I will go over how I set up my Asana projects for that. So the next thing I do is I leverage Buzzsprout as my hosting platform. I really love Buzzsprout. I rave about it. There will be a link in the show notes for it as well if you want to go over and check it out, because the great thing about Buzzsprout is you can get started for free, So they give you 90 days of free hosting with them. And then when you choose a plan to go on to pay for it, you get so many great features available to you. So they've just introduced this text me fan mail tab on there. So there is now a link. If you go over to my Mindset and Action podcast, you will see at the top of every description now there is a text me link, and you can actually send me a message directly into my Buzzsprout from my podcast. So without you having to go over on social and find me over there, without you having to go to my website or anything, you can literally get direct contact with me through Buzzsprout, which I absolutely love. Now, if you look in the show notes for this podcast, you're not going to see that because currently this podcast isn't on Buzzsprout, and that's because I wanted to test an alternate platform for you guys so that I could be more knowledgeable on other platforms, because it's all good saying, Buzzsprout's the best and that's what I use, but if you haven't ever tried anything else, you can't really say for sure. So I did try something else. I'm not liking it as much, but I will likely move this back over to Buzzsprout at some point. It's just because it's seasonal, it's not as many episodes going out, it's not going out every time, and then I'm like paying for hours that I'm not using. It's like, it's all a bit of a thing. So we will see where I go with this one as a serial podcast. But for Mindset and Action, I'm over there. I pay for Buzzsprout. And the other thing that I pay for on Buzzsprout is their co-host AI. So over in Buzzsprout now, they have got the co-host AI. It's $10 a month. And to me, that is worth it because it's like having a virtual assistant help me with my podcast. I load the podcast into Buzzsprout and it takes maybe 5 to 10 minutes to listen to the podcast episode, and it then creates a description for it. It then creates a blog post for it. It also produces a transcript for it. So to me, I'm never going to sit down and do a transcript. I would obviously use another transcript creator, but that all takes time and means that I've got to load it into that transcript maker and let it do its thing and everything else. Whereas with Buzzsprout, it all does it all at once. It also gives me title options, so I can fiddle around with those. It gives me sort of maybe 4 or 5 different title options that I could choose from, and I can either use those or I could make one of my own, or I could just adjust what theirs is to something that's more appropriate for me. So it means that I'm not starting from zero. All I have to do is go through and just change Z's to S's because, it's Americanized, and just change some of the tenses. Sometimes, I like it to come from me rather than like somebody writing about me. So I like to change the tense there and make it a me rather than third person. Buzzsprout is a really great platform to host your podcast on, but using that AI feature has really allowed me to streamline that system because I wasn't creating blog posts before, so it's not like I needed the blog post creating for me. But since I have that, now I have a blog because it gives me another way to create SEO searchability for my podcast episodes. So it's given me something that I would never have done because I just wouldn't have had the time to do it. And now it takes me maybe 5-10 minutes to get that blog up onto my website, embed my podcast player on there, and have an SEO searchable platform that episode can be found on. So I really find the co-host AI is really, really useful. So that forms part of my systems. The other thing that I utilize a lot is ChatGPT. So ChatGPT, for those of you who don't know, is an AI assistant. I think everybody has probably heard of it by now. A lot of people are still sort of wary of these kind of AI assistants, but I find it really, really useful for quite a few things, and it is basically it's time saving. So I will create my podcast outlines from ChatGPT. Usually I will go in there and I say I want to do a podcast on this topic, I want to make 3 points. Can you give me a podcast outline? And it will give me a podcast outline. Now, I may tell it the 3 points that I want to talk about, or I may just let it do its thing. And then I check through that and I go, okay, yeah, I can talk about that. That's a great point to make. Yeah, that's a great point to make. Oh, no, I don't like that one. I'm going to talk about this instead. So it's just, again, getting you away from that blank page, which it just takes you time sometimes. When you're not in a creative mood, you can't produce creative things. But ChatGPT it's not ever not in a creative mood. It's always ready to be creative. So it will produce an outline for me. And then the other way that I use it is afterwards, I will take the blog post that Buzzsprout's co-host has created. I will put that into ChatGPT and I will say, here is a blog post for an upcoming podcast episode. Please create me 10 Pinterest pins with titles and descriptions. Make the descriptions about 500 characters long. And then it will produce me 10 different Pinterest titles and descriptions. And that saves me so much time, because if I've got to think of 10 different titles for one podcast episode, that would take me forever because I'd just keep repeating myself. And with Pinterest, it's another search engine. It's another searchable base for my podcast to be. Now, not necessarily appropriate for every single type of business, but I am testing it out at the moment. I've been sort of saying this in various places that I'm testing it out, and I'll come back with some results for you. But I want to give it a good test. So I'm probably looking at 6 months to a year before I feed back on what, if anything, it is doing. I'm certainly seeing my numbers increase. I'm kind of getting 2 pins out a day at the moment, and that seems to be generating around 1,000 views on my pins a month at the moment. So I'm going to be monitoring that. When I started, I was getting maybe 300 views on them, and I wasn't pinning regularly, and I wasn't pinning a lot. So the amount that I pin now has increased and the regularity of it has increased, and I'm trying to keep to 2 minimum a day, because if you stop, you really do see a decrease in the amount of attention that your account's getting. And maybe you get to a certain level and it doesn't matter so much how much you're posting, but I certainly see the difference at the moment. So getting your podcast out there to the world and sharing it in as many places as possible is one of the things that kind of takes up a lot of time for podcasters. And for most podcasters, it's not their business, it's part of their business. And I always talk of it being your long tail marketing tool. So this is something that you're looking at producing you new people into your business over a long period of time. It's not about an instant gratification. It's not like a Facebook ad where you can like throw $200 at it, or £500, whatever, and get a load of leads in. It is about that nurturing, that growing, and making people understand who you are as a person, so they know if they want to work with you. From making what you do, telling them what you do so that they can really get a feel for what it is that they're going to get from you if they work from you, and just showcasing your expertise. So all of that needs to be disseminated out into the world some way. And you can't just produce a podcast and think that people are just going to come and listen to it, because it doesn't happen like that. And it doesn't happen like that with anything these days. You have to put some effort in. So I put out 10 pins per podcast episode, because you can have as many pins as you like going to the same website page. So 10 pins per podcast episode go out, and I need different titles and different descriptions for each of those pins, so that you can kind of, you can judge what kind of words work better, what pictures work better. So I have also a library of Pinterest pin templates that I use, and I just reuse them. I might change the brand color to one of my other brand colors. I might change the picture out. The fonts tend to stay the same, but I might change my header font for my body font and things like that. So I keep them interesting, so they're not all exactly the same, but they are all very branded to me and my business and my podcasts. I put 10 pins out for each podcast episode, and ChatGPT helps me with that. So it's really useful for that purpose. And then I also have done before put in so for this podcast, for example, I told you that this one isn't with Buzzsprout, so I don't have the blog post. So what I do is I have a transcription device, software that I use. So I will drop this episode into that device. It will give me the transcript. I will then copy the transcript and put that into ChatGPT and say, give me a podcast summary. And if it's too long, I will break it into two, and this is the first half of a podcast. Give me a summary, 2 paragraphs on this, and then do the same for the second half. Then I've got my description, and then I will say from the podcast transcript, please give me 10 Pinterest pins. I will then also say, from the podcast transcript, please give me 4 titles that would work for this episode. And I will then say, from the podcast transcript, can you pull out 3 quotes that I can use to promote the episode on social media? And then you have to be careful, because oftentimes it will make up a quote. It will take something you've said, but it will mash it together to make its own quote, which isn't actually something you've said as a full sentence. So you need to watch out for those things, but it just gives me an idea of where to go in the transcript to find something good to pull from. And I found that useful as well. So ChatGPT really helps to sort of streamline that process and make those things quicker, so that I am just working from a summary that's already there. So it's like my assistant's written it, and I'm just going through making sure that it makes sense and that it is appropriate for what I want, rather than me sitting there and having to type out 4 paragraphs about what the podcast episode is about. For you, that might not be an issue. Maybe you're a writer. For me, I find keyboards an issue. I just don't seem to be able to spell very well on keyboards. Give me a pen and paper, I'm fine. Keyboard, I am all over the place, and I would rather just let something else create the content and me go and check it afterwards and make sure it's saying what I want it to say. So ChatGPT is a great way to help me streamline those processes. And then I've already kind of mentioned a little bit there that I use Canva for the pins, but I use Canva for all my social media posts to do with my podcast, for the Pinterest pins, and I also use it to schedule as well. So I use Canva to schedule to my Pinterest, and then if I am doing my social media the way I want to do my social media, I also will schedule from my Canva to my social media platforms. Certain things that you can't do with that, I still don't think you can do video reels on Instagram through Canva, so I would have to do those natively, but I don't mind that, because I like to be on my profiles personally as much as possible, because I feel that makes a difference to the engagement. However, if I can schedule it, I will, because it just saves time. So that is what I do with Canva. And if you don't know Canva very well, or you want some help with Canva, I highly recommend going and joining Marie-Louise O'Neill's Facebook group, which I will leave linked in the show notes for you. She is a Canva expert. She is a designer. She is a brand designer, and she also helps people with their Canva as well. So she's a great person to follow, and being part of that group, you can ask questions in there on Canva. So that is it, guys. That is kind of an overview of how I have my systems set up to help me with my podcast. Using ChatGPT and the co-host AI really saves me a huge amount of time on the things that I produce for my podcast. It really does enable me to be much more efficient. So I would highly recommend looking at those as options. If you're somebody who's like, oh, I really need an assistant, but I really can't afford it, having a co-host AI assistant on Buzzsprout is definitely worth £10 a month. So, and I think it's $10 actually, so it's less in pounds. It is really worth it. And it's things like that you can do that are going to allow you to have more time to yourself to do what you need to do, but be promoting yourself in a better way whilst you are still solo working. So I hope that has helped you with looking at what you can do for your podcast and how you would do your systems. Having your systems and processes in place is so important to the longevity of your podcast. So I would definitely take some time to sit down and go, okay, what is my workflow? What does it look like? What do I need to do? What tools can I use to make it simpler? What software is out there that I can use that is just going to help this process be as streamlined as possible? Take that time to do that because it is going to make the difference between you using it as a long-term marketing tool like I do, or falling off the wagon because it just gets too much. There is so much you can do. It's really important to assess for yourself what's going to work best for you. You know, you do not have to do a blog for your podcast. I have chosen to do a blog for my podcast because I want that history and I want the SEO searchability from that. You could just use your description as that SEO pull that's going to go to your podcast website. So there's things that I do that you might think, I don't want to do that. There are things that I don't do that you might think, well, I also want to do this. So just take some time to really sort of work out what you want your podcast workflow to look like, and then start building in the systems and the processes around that to make it happen, and write it out as an SOP, a standard operating procedure, because if you do get a VA at some point, you want to have them have something in writing that says this is how the podcast is done. So you can hand off some of that work to your VA and they'll know exactly the steps that need to happen to create a podcast episode and get it out into the world. So I hope that helps. If you need me, do come and connect with me over on social, Donna_Eade_, spelled EADE, on Instagram. Drop me a DM. I'll be happy to answer your questions. And this is, like I said, the penultimate episode of this series. So make sure you are subscribed to donnaeade.com/pod squad to get notified when season 2 arrives. Until next week and our final episode, bye for now. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Mic Action podcast and are enjoying the series so far. If you are, make sure to drop a review where you listen and share it with a friend. Until next time.